Every Monday, punctual as the city bells, I saw it. That small, worn, brown suitcase sitting by the front door in the entryway. And every Monday, with that same precision, it vanished along with him. At first, I paid it no mind. The explanations were so reasonable, so perfectly woven into the fabric of our daily lives. But then I began to notice the changes. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, like a scent in a room that you don't recognize right away. A word spoken differently. A sudden, sharp interest in things he'd never cared about before. Small lies, stacking up one by one, growing like hairline cracks in a wall I believed was solid stone. I didn't know yet that following that suitcase would lead me to discover that the man I loved, the man I had built my life with, didn't really exist at all. My name is Nora Hartwood, and I am 78 years old. I live in a small apartment here in New York City, surrounded by books that tell stories, some imagined and some, like mine, lived. My own story I've kept hidden away for a very long time. It's been locked in a place deep inside me. But today, I feel that the time has finally come to share it. I was a young woman when I arrived in this city, barely in my 20s. I worked as a professor of folklore at the university. My passion was for the spoken word, for the old songs, for the stories people tell to make sense of the world. It led me to dedicate my life to teaching. I came from far away, from a small town tucked into the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky, a place near Harlan County where the hollers are deep and the dialect is as strong and thick as molasses in winter. I carried my home with me, not in a suitcase, but in my words, in the mountain cadence of my voice that, despite all the years in New York, I never fully lost. I didn't want to. It was mine. It was my mama's and her mama's before her. It was the sound of home. I met him at a conference on American folklore and oral traditions. Robert. He was charming, not in a flashy way, but in the quiet, intense way he spoke about books, about history, about cultural memory. He won me over by talking about the very things I held sacred. He spoke with such passion about the old ballads, the stories from the coal mines, the remnants of folk magic and remedies. He discussed metaphors and symbolism with a fire I believed, with all my heart, was authentic. Your perspective is fascinating, he told me over coffee, his voice the smooth, educated sound of the city. You don't just study it. You've lived it. You are a primary source, Nora. I should have recognized that word. Source. Not a person, but a thing to be drawn from. But I was young, and I was flattered. We were married after a year. A simple ceremony at the courthouse. I still remember the scent of the city rain on the pavement that day. We started our life together in an apartment not far from the university. I taught, and he worked at a small, respectable publishing house. Or at least, that is what I believed he did. The first few years were quiet and, in their own way, happy. We shared a passion for books, for long conversations deep into the night, often over a shared pot of tea. He would tell me about the manuscripts he was reading, the new literary discoveries, the young talents he was trying to promote. And I told him about my childhood. I told him about Kentucky. I told him about the stories my mama used to tell me in front of the wood stove during the long, cold winters. Stories of a land that was ancient, mysterious, sometimes cruel, but always, always real. I told him about the hard winters, about the belief that you never swept your floor after dark, or you'd sweep away your luck. I told him the story of the haint, the restless spirit of a miner who was said to walk the tracks. I described the smell of the damp earth, the taste of spring water from the well, the complex rules of community in a place the city had forgotten. You should write these stories down, Nora, he said to me often, his eyes fixed on my face. They have a flavor that's been lost today. They're true. But I would laugh and shake my head. Oh, I'm not a writer, Robert. I'm a teacher. I know how to recognize a good story, but making one is different work altogether. He would insist, looking at me with an intensity that I, in my innocence, mistook for admiration. Today, I know it was calculation. Then at least tell them all to me, he would say, his voice soft. I want to know every corner of your world through your memories. And so I did. I told him everything. I told him about the rituals of canning beans in the fall, the bluegrass music at the county fair, the superstitions about planting by the moon. I spoke to him about our dialect, the specific way we formed our words, the phrases and sayings that only someone born in those hills could truly understand. What does pert mean again? He'd ask. Pert, I'd explain. It means you're feeling spry, feeling better, like Mama's feeling right pert this morning. And he absorbed it all. He took notes. He'd ask me to repeat things, to explain the nuances. Say that again, he'd ask. The way the R sound just disappears. It didn't seem strange to me then. I thought it was a genuine, loving interest in my life, in my roots. How could I possibly have imagined that he was building piece by piece a mask that he would soon wear as his own face? It was after a few years of marriage that I noticed the first real signal. Every Monday, Robert left with that small brown suitcase. He would return late in the evening, sometimes not until Tuesday morning, with tired eyes and a smile that never quite reached them. Meetings with distributors, he would explain, loosening his tie. The publishing house is going through a tough time. We have to coordinate with our people up in Boston. I believed him, every word. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband, the man I had promised to trust and who had promised me his honesty. Then other subtle changes began. New books started appearing on our shelves. They weren't the novels or biographies he usually read. They were obscure folklore journals, books on linguistic theory, dense academic studies of Appalachian culture. He'd never been an academic. He preferred the narrative, the story. But suddenly, he seemed obsessed with theory, with cultural markers, with dialect. I'm broadening my horizons, he said when I pointed it out. It helps with my work. And then there was the tape recorder. It was a small, portable device, and he started carrying it with him everywhere. He would place it discreetly on the table when we talked, especially when I was telling him about my childhood, about the mountain traditions, about my family stories. It's for a project at the publishing house, he justified himself when he saw me looking at it. We're gathering oral histories on American folk culture. Just talk. Don't mind it. It was plausible. It was exactly in his line of work, after all. And I, buried in my own work at the university, grading papers, preparing lectures, I had no reason to doubt him. It made me feel a little strange, talking to a machine, but he made me feel silly for hesitating. But it was his sudden, intense interest in my accent that truly made me pause. Robert was a New Yorker, born and bred. His speech was clear, precise, and flat in the way of the educated Northeast. And yet, suddenly, he wanted me to teach him every shade of my mountain dialect. Not just the words, which he already knew, but the intonations, the cadence, the music of it, the way a sentence would rise at the end, the way we softened our vowels. Why this sudden fascination? I asked him one evening, after I'd corrected his pronunciation of a local saying for the third time. He was trying to say, I reckon I'll go, but it kept coming out harsh, all city. No, Robert, I'd laughed gently. It's softer, I reckon. You don't hit the N so hard. He'd smiled, but his eyes were focused, practicing. It fascinates me, he answered simply. It's so rich, so evocative. It helps me understand the literature, the ballads. Once again, it seemed reasonable. He worked with books. It was natural that he would want to deepen his linguistic knowledge. I let it go. But then, one spring afternoon, I was looking for some insurance papers in his study. He usually kept our important documents in the bottom drawer of his desk. As I was shuffling through files, I found something that changed everything. A notebook. It was a simple, black-bound journal, the kind you buy at any bookstore. I opened it, thinking it was just more work notes, but it was poems, written by hand in Robert's familiar, neat script. Poems that spoke of the deep woods, of the coal dust settling on the porch, of the scent of wildflowers in a mountain spring. Poems about legends that I had told him. I read one about a woman waiting for her husband to come home from the mine, a story my own mama had told me about her mother. It was beautiful and it was painful. And then I turned the page and saw the signature at the bottom. Robert Hartwood. Hartwood, my maiden name, not his. I stood frozen, the notebook heavy in my hands. A cold feeling, sharp as a winter needle, pierced my back. Why? Why would he sign poems with my family name? And why were these poems describing experiences he had never lived, but that I had described to him in perfect, intimate detail? I kept turning the pages, my heart pounding a sick rhythm against my ribs. I found more poems, and then short prose pieces, brief stories that I recognized with a jolt. They were my childhood stories, transformed into poetic prose. Stories I had confided to him on quiet evenings, stories of my deepest self, my most private memories. They were changed, elaborated on, but they were undeniably mine. The story of my brother falling in the creek, the story of my first time seeing the ocean on a family trip, the story of my mama's hands, how they looked making biscuits. And then, on the very last page of the notebook, there was a paragraph that looked like a biographical note. I read the words, and the floor seemed to drop out from under me. Robert Hartwood, born in Harlan, Kentucky, a professor of folklore and an acclaimed poet. His work springs from a deep ancestral connection to the Appalachian Mountains, its ancient traditions, and the rich linguistic heritage of the local dialect. It was a lie, a complete, detailed, elaborate lie. Robert was not born in Kentucky. He had never even been to Kentucky before we met. He had no connection to the traditions he was describing. He wasn't a professor of folklore. I was. He was building a false identity, a whole new person, and he was using my life, my roots, my family, and my stories to do it. I sat there in his study for what must have been hours, just holding that black notebook, trying to make sense of the betrayal. My mind was reeling. Who was this man I was married to? Part of me, the part that was angry and hurt, wanted to run out and confront him the second he walked in the door, to throw the notebook at his feet and demand he explain this sickness. But another part of me, a colder, quieter part, held me back. It whispered that I needed to wait, to observe, to understand just how deep this fiction went. I put the notebook back exactly where I had found it, under the insurance policies. I closed the drawer. I walked out of the study and shut the door, but it felt like a different door, in a different house. That evening, when Robert came home, without his suitcase, as it was not a Monday, I looked at him with new eyes. I watched him kiss my cheek. I watched him complain about the subway, about his boss at the publishing house. It was like watching a performance. Who was this man, and what was he planning? In the days that followed, I became an observer in my own home. I started to pay sharp attention to his movements, his words, his absences. I noticed how he would quickly hang up the phone if I walked into the room, how he spent long hours locked in his study, having quiet, intense conversations I was never included in, how those Monday trips to Boston were becoming more frequent, sometimes stretching into Tuesday. And then there were the letters. Envelopes began arriving, addressed to him, but with the logos of literary magazines I'd never heard of publishing houses different from the one he supposedly worked for. Letters that he would quickly slide into his briefcase or take into his study. One night, I was eating dinner alone. He was once again in Boston for work. I couldn't stand the not knowing anymore. I picked the simple lock on his desk drawer, the one I'd never had a reason to open. I didn't find the black notebook. He must have taken it with him. But I found other things. I found drafts of more poems. I found letters of praise. "Mr. Hartwood," one began, "your reading was mesmerizing. The authenticity of your voice is a rare thing in this city." "Dear Professor Hartwood," read another, "we would be honored to have you speak at our symposium on the Appalachian voice." Professor Hartwood, the lie wasn't just on paper. It wasn't just a fantasy. He was living it. He was performing it. I found a flyer for a weekly lecture series at a small cultural center in Greenwich Village. Appalachian Identity and the Written Word, a workshop with Robert Hartwood. It was held on Monday evenings. This is where he went, not Boston, not meetings with distributors. He took the subway downtown to teach a class on a culture that wasn't his, using stories he had stolen from me. I felt a wave of nausea so strong I had to sit on the floor. He hadn't just stolen my stories. He had stolen my job. He had stolen my name. He had stolen my voice. I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of his deception, and a cold, hard anger began to form inside me. It wasn't the hot anger of a betrayal in love. It was the cold, deep anger of violation. He hadn't just cheated on me. He had cheated me, stolen the very essence of who I was. I put everything back. I locked the drawer. I washed my plate and went to bed. The following Monday, I made a decision. When Robert left the apartment in the morning, carrying his small brown suitcase, I waited 10 minutes. Then I put on my coat, and I followed him. I had never followed anyone in my life. The very act felt wrong, a violation of the trust I thought our marriage was built on. I felt cheap, like a spy in a bad movie, my heart hammering against my ribs with a mixture of fear and self-loathing. But beneath that was a harder, colder feeling, the absolute, driving need to know the truth. I kept my distance, staying half a block behind, using the morning crowds as my cover. Robert walked with his usual brisk city pace, his suitcase swinging lightly at his side. He went straight to the subway station, but he didn't go to the platform for the train to Grand Central, the one he would have taken to go to Boston. He swiped his card and went downtown. I followed, slipping through the turnstile just a few people behind him. I got into the same car, standing at the far end, my back to him, watching his reflection in the dark glass of the window opposite. He just read his newspaper, the picture of a normal commuter. But I knew. I knew the paper was a prop. I knew the man holding it was a stranger. Every screech of the wheels on the track felt like it was scraping against my own nerves. The car was crowded, smelling of damp wool and coffee. I felt invisible, a ghost haunting my own husband. Was this what he did every Monday? Ride this train, carrying his little case of lies? I gripped the metal pole, my knuckles white, as the train lurched downtown. 10 minutes passed, then 15. We passed the stops for the financial district, for the courthouses. And then he stood up. He got off in Greenwich Village. I waited until the last second, slipping through the doors just as they were closing, my heart in my throat. He was already walking up the steps to the street. I hurried after him. When I emerged onto the street, I had to pause. The village was a world away from our quiet uptown neighborhood. It was a place of old brownstones, winding streets, artists, and tiny theaters. It was a neighborhood that prided itself on its authenticity, on its bohemian spirit. It was, I realized with a sick lurch, the perfect place to sell a fantasy. Robert walked with purpose, turning onto a quiet, tree-lined street. He seemed to know exactly where he was going. He walked past antique shops, past cafes with poets sitting in the windows. It all felt like a stage set. I wondered how the real hardship of my home, the coal dust and the poverty and the deep, unshakable faith would look to these people. To them, it was just a flavor, something to be tried on. He stopped in front of a handsome old brick building with a dark green door. He took a key from his pocket, a key I had never seen, one that did not hang on the ring by our door, and he let himself in. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone on the sidewalk. I stood there, hidden behind a large tree, my body trembling. He was in there. His other life was in that building. I waited for several minutes, just breathing, trying to calm the panic rising in my chest. What was he doing? Changing clothes? Preparing for his performance? I had to know. I crossed the street, my legs feeling like lead, and I walked up the few stone steps to the entrance. The building had an old-fashioned entryway, and on the wall was a brass panel with small labeled bells for the apartments. My finger trembled as I scanned the names. I looked for Robert's name. It wasn't there. I scanned again, my mind foggy with disbelief. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe this was a misunderstanding. Maybe he was just visiting a colleague, a writer. And then I saw it. It wasn't under R for Robert. It was under H. My breath caught in my chest. The label was neatly typed, slipped into the brass holder. It read, Professor Robert Hartwood, Apt 3B, Professor. He had stolen my title, Hartwood. He had stolen my name, my family's name, the name of my father and my mama. He had plastered it on a doorbell in Greenwich Village as if it were his own. I stared at the name, Hartwood, and a white-hot anger, purer and cleaner than any I had ever felt, burned away my fear. He had no right. He had no right to my name, to my home, to the stories that were bought with the sweat and tears of my family. I was so consumed by my rage that I almost didn't move in time. The front door opened. I instinctively jumped back, hiding myself in the shadow of the staircase. A young woman came out, holding the door open for someone behind her. She was young, with an eager, earnest expression, and she was clutching a notebook. And then Robert followed her out. But it wasn't Robert. Not my Robert. My Robert, the man who lived with me, wore conservative suits, plain ties. He was a city man, neat and tidy. This man was a performance. He was wearing a tweed jacket, worn at the elbows. He had on a pair of slightly scuffed boots that looked like they were meant for walking on dirt roads, not city pavement. He had a scarf tossed carelessly around his neck. He looked, I thought with a curl of my lip, exactly like a city person's idea of a mountain intellectual. But the clothes were not the worst part. The worst part was his voice. "Well now, I reckon that's the heart of the matter, isn't it?" he said to the young woman. The voice. It was my voice. It was my cadence. It was the soft, lilting sound of my home, the accent I had patiently, lovingly explained to him. He was wearing my accent like a costume, and he was good at it. The way he softened the word heart, the gentle "I reckon." It was a perfect, sickening imitation. I flattened myself against the wall, my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. He was standing not 10 feet from me. The young woman was nodding, scribbling furiously in her notebook. "That's brilliant, Professor Hartwood, the heart of the matter." I love that. He gave a small, modest laugh, a gesture I had never seen him use. It was a folksy, humble gesture. "Oh, it's just old words, my dear. The old words are always the truest, don't you find?" He was gesticulating differently, too. His movements were slower, more considered, as if he were a simple countryman, full of homespun wisdom. It was grotesque. I watched them walk down the steps and head down the street, talking animatedly. The young woman looked like she was interviewing him, hanging on his every word with a look of pure, unadulterated admiration. I followed them again, but this time my feelings were different. The hurt was still there, but it was frozen, buried under a layer of cold, assessing ice. I was no longer a betrayed wife. I was a researcher. I was a professor of folklore, and I was watching a fraud. They walked 2 blocks and settled at an outdoor table at a small, literary-themed cafe. I took a seat across the street, at another cafe, partially hidden by a planter box. From there, I could see them clearly, but I couldn't hear most of what they said. I didn't need to. I could see the performance. I watched Professor Hartwood lean back in his chair, clasping his hands behind his head as he told a story. The young woman laughed, her head tilted. I saw him point at her notebook, his expression turning serious, as if he were imparting some ancient secret knowledge. And I just knew, he was telling her one of my stories. Was it the story of my uncle's logging accident, or the one about my mama seeing the haint by the railroad tracks? I watched him, my stomach twisting, as he packaged my family's private pains and beliefs and sold them for the price of this young woman's admiration. This was what he craved. This was what the publishing house, his real, boring job, could never give him. He didn't want to be a mid-level editor. He wanted to be the source. He wanted to be authentic. And since he had no authenticity of his own, he had simply, methodically, stolen mine. After an hour, the young woman stood up. She shook his hand with both of hers, a gesture of deep respect. She thanked him profusely, and then she left. Robert, the fake Robert, remained at the table. He looked satisfied, leaning back in his chair with a small, pleased smile. He looked like an actor who had just come off stage after a standing ovation. He raised his hand to signal the waiter. I stayed perfectly still, watching. This, I felt, was important. The waiter came over, and I heard Robert speak, his fake mountain voice carrying clearly across the quiet street. "I'll have another coffee, if you'd be so kind," he said. Then he smiled at the waiter, a warm, folksy smile. "And make it as strong as a miner's will, and as black as a holler at midnight. My old mama always said, 'A weak coffee is a wasted day.'" My blood ran cold. That was my mama's line, word for word, a phrase I had told him in confidence, a little piece of family lore, a joke between my mother and her sisters. He had taken that intimate, private memory and used it to order coffee from a stranger, to prop up his lie. It was the most profound violation yet. It was more than the name, more than the accent. He was taking the sacred, personal details of my life and turning them into catchphrases for his character. In that single, awful moment, I understood the full scope of his betrayal. He hadn't just used my surname to sign a few poems. He was living a parallel life. He had an apartment, a title, a whole persona as Professor Robert Hartwood. He was giving interviews, teaching classes, and building a career on a foundation of my memories. And I, like a fool, had been his primary source, his unpaid researcher. I had sat in our living room and fed him every line, every story, every nuance he needed to make his elaborate lie believable. I watched him sip his coffee, the picture of the authentic mountain poet. A wave of sickness washed over me. That man, that stranger, was the man I shared a bed with. He was the man I loved, or had loved. The person I loved, the quiet, steady, city-born Robert, was he even real? Or was he just the mask the actor wore when he came home before he put on his other mask? I had to get out of there. I stood up, my legs shaking, and threw a few dollars on my own table. I walked away before he could look up, before he could accidentally see me. I walked fast, turning corners at random, just trying to put distance between myself and that thing in the tweed jacket. I didn't go home. I couldn't. I couldn't go back to our apartment, which now felt like nothing more than the backstage dressing room for his performance. I walked all the way to the park, and I sat on a bench, watching the people pass by until the sun started to set and the air grew cold. I had to decide what to do. I could go to that apartment 3B and pound on the door. I could confront him right there in the middle of his lie. I could scream and cry and demand to know why. But what would that accomplish? He would lie. He would twist it. He would say it was research or an artistic project. He would make me seem crazy, hysterical. No, this was not a crime of passion. This was a cold, calculated, long-term theft. My response had to be just as cold, just as calculated. He was building a career on my back. He was publishing poems, teaching classes. I remembered the black notebook, the one that mentioned his acclaimed work. I needed to know everything. I needed to know how far this went, how much he had published, how much money he was making, how many people he had fooled. I needed evidence. I needed to understand the full scale of this house of lies before I could decide which brick to pull to make the whole thing crash down. When I finally went home that night, it was late. He was already there, my Robert, back from his tiring trip to Boston. He was in his usual clothes, reading the newspaper. He looked up and smiled when I walked in. "Hey, Nora, long day at the university?" he asked, his voice the normal, flat city accent I had always known. I looked at him, the man who had, just hours before, been performing as a Kentucky poet. I looked at his familiar face, and I felt nothing but ice. "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "A very long day." I went into the kitchen to make tea, and as I waited for the water to boil, I made a vow. I would not cry, I would not yell, I would wait, I would watch. And I would gather the proof. His performance was over. Mine was just beginning. The next week was a blur of poisoned normality. I went to work. I graded papers. I sat across the dinner table from Robert, listening to him talk about his work at the publishing house, all while the image of Professor Hartwood in his tweed jacket was burned into my mind. I was an actress now, just as he was an actor. I smiled, I nodded, I asked the right questions. But inside, I was made of ice. I was waiting. My chance came the following Monday. He packed his small brown suitcase, the same ritual as always. "Off to Boston, dear," he said, pecking my cheek. "These meetings are getting more frequent. I might even have to stay overnight." "Oh, that's a shame," I said, my voice perfectly light. "But work is work. Be safe." I watched him walk out the door, the click of the lock sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet apartment. I counted to 100, my hands steady. Then I went straight to his study. Before, I had been looking for a reason. Now I was looking for ammunition. I didn't bother with the locked desk drawer. I knew from my research at the university that a determined person could open most simple locks. I went to our kitchen, got a thin metal skewer, and in less than a minute, the lock clicked open. I felt no guilt. This was not his private space anymore. It was a crime scene. The black notebook was not there. He must have taken it with him, his book of stolen inspiration. But there were other things. I found a file folder tucked in the very back, under a pile of old tax returns. It was labeled simply Hartwood. My blood ran cold. I opened it. It wasn't poems. It was bank statements. A separate account at a different bank, one I had never heard of. An account in the name of Robert Hartwood. I sat down in his chair, my legs suddenly weak. The numbers on the page swam before my eyes. They were not small. There were deposits from literary magazines, payments from the cultural center in the village, and, most shocking of all, large, recurring deposits from a major, prestigious publishing house, one of the biggest in the city and not the one he supposedly worked for. He was making a significant amount of money from this. This wasn't just about ego, about playing a part. This was a second, secret, lucrative career. He had monetized my life. He had turned my mama's memories into a paycheck. I dug deeper into the file. I found the correspondence, letters from a senior editor at that same prestigious publishing house. "Dear Robert," one read, "we are all on the edge of our seats for the final manuscript of Echoes from the Holler. The sample chapters you sent are extraordinary. The authenticity, the raw, lyrical voice. It's a revelation. We have scheduled the launch and a press tour for next month. This is going to be your masterpiece. Echoes from the Holler. A novel. An entire novel. My hands were shaking as I put the letters down. Where was it? Where was the manuscript? I tore the study apart. I looked behind bookshelves, under the desk, in every drawer. Nothing. He must keep the main copy with him or in his secret apartment in the village. But he was a meticulous man, my Robert. He always kept copies. I looked at the filing cabinet again. It was a standard 2-drawer metal cabinet. I pulled open the bottom drawer, the one filled with old warranties and manuals. I felt around in the back, behind the hanging files. My fingers brushed against something solid. It was a large, heavy box of printer paper. But it felt too heavy. I dragged it out. Under the ream of blank paper was a thick, bound manuscript. The title page read, Echoes from the Holler, a Novel, by Robert Hartwood. I sank to the floor, my back against the filing cabinet, and I began to read. The first few pages were what I expected. Poetic, flowery descriptions of the mountains, the scent of pine and damp earth, the sound of a screen door slamming. It was all the atmosphere I had described to him, all the little details I had shared. But then, the story began. And the air left my lungs. It wasn't just based on my stories. It was my story. He had written it in the first person. The narrator, a young boy named Robbie, was growing up in a small house in a Kentucky holler. I read, my horror growing with every page, as Robbie described events from my life. My most sacred, painful, private memories, all stolen and twisted to fit his male narrator. He had stolen the story of my brother, how he had fallen into the freezing creek, and I had run all the way home for help, my lungs burning. In the book, Robbie saved his little sister. He had stolen the death of my mama. I had told Robert, in a moment of deep vulnerability one night, about that last week. About how I had sat by her bed, holding her hand, and how she had whispered to me about the haint she saw in the corner, waiting for her. It was a sacred, terrifying memory. He had put it in his book, word for word. Robbie sat by his grandmother's bed, and she whispered those exact words to him. I felt a physical sickness, a cold, acidic bile rising in my throat. This was not appropriation. This was not inspiration. This was an excavation. He had dug into my soul with a shovel, pulled out my most precious, formative experiences, and claimed them as his own. He was a grave robber. I read on, my vision blurring with a rage so cold it felt like grief. He had stolen my first heartbreak, the story of the neighbor boy who had moved away. He had stolen the story of my papa teaching me to identify plants in the woods. He had stolen the painful, secret story of my family's poverty, the shame I felt as a child, all of it, repackaged as his heroic struggle. He had taken my entire identity, the very things that had shaped me into the woman I was, and he had built his masterpiece on top of them. I closed the manuscript. I couldn't breathe. I felt erased. It was as if I didn't exist, as if my own life was no longer mine. That man, that parasite, had consumed me. I sat there for a long time, on the floor of his study, the heavy manuscript in my lap. The ice in my veins was hardening into something else. It was hardening into steel. He was not going to publish this book. I was not going to let this lie stand. But I still needed more. Confronting him with a manuscript he could deny, with bank statements he could explain away as a private project, wasn't enough. I needed to see the public face of his fraud. I carefully put the manuscript back, replaced the blank paper, and slid the box into its hiding place. I put the Hartwood file back, relocked the drawer, and wiped my fingerprints off the metal skewer. I put every book, every paper, back exactly as it had been. I left the study pristine, as if I had never been there. The next day, I called in sick to the university. I told my department head I had a terrible migraine. Instead, I went to the main public library, the one on Fifth Avenue. I didn't want to use the university computers. I didn't want any record of my searches. I sat down at a public terminal in a vast, quiet reading room surrounded by strangers, and I began searching for Robert Hartwood in the library's new digital periodical database. What I found made me sick all over again. He wasn't just some small-time village performer. He was known. I found articles in literary journals, reviews of his 2 published collections of poetry. The critics were ecstatic. "The authentic voice of Appalachia," one review proclaimed. "Hartwood writes with the authority of lived experience, a raw, unvarnished truth that is missing in modern poetry." Another called him a vital link to a disappearing American heritage. I found his author photo. It was the man from the village. The tweed jacket, the thoughtful, wise expression, the artfully messy hair. It was a complete stranger. And then I found the interview. It was an audio recording of a popular public radio interview available in the library's media archives, recorded just a few months ago. The title was "Speaking from the Mountain, a Conversation with Robert Hartwood." My hand was trembling so badly I could barely click the mouse. I put on the headphones and pressed play. First, there was the host's smooth, admiring voice, and then his voice, the fake one, the soft, lilting, musical cadence he had stolen from me. "Well now," he said, and I had to close my eyes. I'm always a little humbled when people say that. I don't reckon I'm anything special. I'm just telling the stories that my mama gave me. The stories of the holler, you know. The host asked him about his childhood. "Oh, it was hard," Robert said, his voice full of a false, gentle sadness. "But it was true. I remember my papa," he used to say. He'd say, "Son, the truth is like a good tree. It's got deep roots and it don't bend for no wind." We didn't have much, but we had the stories. I ripped the headphones off, my heart pounding. That was my papa's line. Another piece of my family, another private saying, turned into a folksy soundbite for his adoring public. I put the headphones back on, forcing myself to listen. "Tell us about the title of your first poetry book, Haint Blues," the host said. "Ah, yes," Robert sighed, as if pulling up a deep and painful memory. "My mama, when she was on her deathbed, she was a simple woman, but she saw things. She looked at me, and she said..." I hit the stop button. I couldn't listen to him recount that sacred, awful moment from my life, from my memory, and sell it as his own. This was the man who had lied about Boston. This was the man who had created Professor Hartwood. This was the man who was about to publish a novel that was, in fact, my autobiography. He had left nothing for me. He had taken it all. I sat there, staring at the screen, my mind working, the cold steel certainty growing stronger. He had built this entire world of lies. He had a fake name, a fake apartment, a fake voice, a fake history, and a fake career. And he had built it all on me. A house built on such a rotten foundation cannot stand. I scrolled through the search results, past the gushing reviews, past the links to buy his poetry. And then I found what I was looking for. It was an announcement from the New York Literary Festival, one of the most prestigious events of the year, held in 3 weeks. "We are honored to announce our keynote speaker, Robert Hartwood. Mr. Hartwood will be giving the debut public reading from his highly anticipated first novel, Echoes from the Holler. He will be in conversation with..." I stared at the screen. His masterpiece, his big moment, the culmination of all his lies, all his theft. He was going to stand on a stage in front of the most important people in the literary world, and he was going to read my life story as his. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It wasn't a happy smile. It was a smile that understood finally exactly what needed to be done. He wanted a stage. He wanted an audience. I would make sure he got one. I logged off the terminal. The announcement for the literary festival glowed in my mind like a hot coal, his keynote speech. The debut of my life, presented as his. I sat there in the cold, cavernous silence of the library, and for the first time, the icy numbness began to recede, replaced by a slow, burning, methodical anger. He wasn't just going to be exposed, he was going to be the architect of his own destruction. He wanted a stage? I would build it for him, board by board. I went home. I made dinner. I forced myself to be the person I had been for the last few years, the quiet, supportive, slightly naive wife. When Robert returned from his Monday class, he was in a bright, energetic mood. He was energized by his performance, by the adoration I had seen on that young woman's face. "You're in good spirits," I said, handing him a plate. "Just a good day," he said, avoiding my eyes. "The Boston trip was productive. Things are looking up at the publishing house." A lie, so smooth, so practiced. He didn't even blink. That night, as we were reading in bed, I laid the first stone of my trap. "You know," I said, sighing as I closed my book and put it on the nightstand, "I was thinking about home today, about Mama." He turned, his attention immediately snared. This was his favorite topic. "Oh," he said, putting his own book down. His eyes had that familiar, intense, calculating look. "Yes," I said, letting my voice grow soft and nostalgic, mimicking the very thing he tried to copy. "I was just remembering something she used to tell me about. Oh, it's silly." "No, what?" he prompted, his voice gentle. "I love your stories, Nora. You know that." "I know you do." "I was just remembering the snow blossoms," I said. "The what?" "The snow blossoms," I repeated, as if sharing a sacred secret. "You've never heard of those. Almost nobody has. They're not in any of the folklore books. Mama said it was a family story. They were these tiny, deep blue flowers, almost the color of a winter twilight. They only grew on the north side of Harlan Peak, and they only bloomed after the first deep snow." I watched him. He was completely still. "Flowers in the snow?" he asked, his voice sharp with interest. "That's what made them so special," I whispered. "Mama said they were God's tears, frozen in the cold. She said finding one meant you'd have good luck for the whole year. We used to go looking for them, my brother and I, wading through the snow, our hands freezing, just hoping to see a little patch of that impossible blue. It was a beautiful lie, poetic, evocative, and utterly biologically impossible. It was my equivalent of flamingos on a volcano. Any person who had ever spent a winter in the mountains would know it was nonsense. But he, a city man who had only read about the mountains, wouldn't. He would only hear the poetry. That's beautiful, Nora," he said, his voice thick with a strange emotion. It was the emotion of a gold prospector striking a new vein. "Snow blossoms." "And Mama had a saying," I added, delivering the final, fatal touch. She'd say, "The mountain keeps its secrets, but it gives its heart to those who look for the blue in the white." She always said that when we came back, disappointed and empty-handed. "The blue in the white," he repeated, tasting the words. "That's incredible." I saw his hand move discreetly to the nightstand, where his small tape recorder lay. He pressed the small red record button, and I just knew, he was recording my voice. I smiled, a small sad smile, and turned off the light. "Just a silly old memory," I said into the darkness. "Good night, Robert." "Good night, Nora," he replied, his voice distant. I could feel the energy coming off him in the dark. He wasn't sleeping. He was writing. He was stealing. I continued this for the next 2 weeks. I became a fountain of false, absurd, but poetic folklore. I told him about the festival of the Whispering Creek, where, I lied, the whole town would gather to listen to the creek tell the future on the spring equinox. I told him about the thunder spoon, a specific metal spoon that my papa supposedly hung from the rafters to keep lightning from striking the house. A ridiculous idea, as metal would attract it. He absorbed it all. He recorded our talks, he took notes. He was a starving man, and I was feeding him poison, beautifully wrapped as authentic home cooking. His excitement about his upcoming big trip grew. He was more cheerful, more affectionate, but also more secretive, spending hours locked in his study, working on a big proposal for the publishing house. I knew he was weaving my new lies into his masterpiece. A week before the festival, I waited for him to leave on his Monday trip. The moment the door closed, I was back in his study. This time, I didn't go for the locked drawer. I went for his computer. I didn't know his password, but I didn't need to. I had watched him type it 100 times, thinking I wasn't paying attention. It was, of all things, Heartwood 1950. The arrogance of it made me sick. I opened his files, and there it was. A new folder labeled NYLF Speech. I clicked it. My heart was a cold stone in my chest. It was a document titled Keynote Address. I scrolled through the pages. It was exactly what I expected. It was a speech built on my life. He opened with the story of my mama's deathbed. He spoke of his hardscrabble childhood, using my words. And then I found it, the climax of the speech. But the memory that sustains me, I read, the image that defines the spirit of my people, is the one my own mama gave me. It is the story of the snow blossoms. Those tiny, impossible blue flowers blooming in the deep winter snow. She called them God's tears. She taught me that the mountain keeps its secrets, but it gives its heart to those who look for the blue in the white. And that is what I have tried to do as a writer. I have looked for the blue in the white. I printed the document. All 12 pages. He had done it. He had taken my most absurd, impossible lie and made it the centerpiece of his keynote address. He had handed me the gun, the bullet, and loaded it himself. I took the printed speech and put it in my purse. The next day, I made a phone call. I arranged a meeting with the director of the New York Literary Festival. I didn't tell him my name over the phone. I just said I had urgent, critical information regarding his keynote speaker, Robert Heartwood. The director, a busy, important-looking man named Mr. Harrison, agreed to see me for 15 minutes. I walked into his impressive office in Midtown, my hands perfectly steady. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, but impatiently, "I was told this was urgent. What is this about?" I sat down in the chair opposite his large desk. "My name," I said, "is Dr. Nora Heartwood. I am a professor of American folklore at the university." I slid my faculty ID and my driver's license across the desk. He looked at the IDs, then up at me, confused. "Heartwood? Any relation to Robert?" "I am his wife," I said. Mr. Harrison's expression softened. "Oh, a pleasure to meet you." "Is Robert all right? We are so looking forward to his address, a truly singular voice." "That," I said, "is what I am here to talk to you about. The voice of Robert Heartwood does not belong to him. It belongs to me." His smile faded. I don't understand." "Mr. Harrison, my husband Robert, was born and raised in Brooklyn. His father was an accountant. He has never in his life lived in Appalachia. The Robert Heartwood you are honoring is a fiction, a character he created." I laid it all out. I explained the Monday trips, the secret apartment, the separate bank account. I told him about the poetry and about the upcoming novel, Echoes from the Holler. He held up a hand. "Mrs. Heartwood, Nora, these are incredibly serious accusations. Robert's work has been vetted. It's authentic. Are you sure this isn't just artistic license? A marital dispute?" I saw the doubt in his eyes. He wanted to believe in his discovery. He didn't want the scandal. "I expected you to say that," I said calmly. "Artistic license is one thing. Theft is another." He didn't just borrow a feeling. He stole my name, my accent, my job title, and my entire life story. The novel you are about to celebrate is my autobiography, twisted to fit a male narrator. Can you prove it? He asked, his voice now cold. Yes, I said. He is a fraud. And he is a lazy one. I know this because I set a trap. And he walked right into it. I pulled the printed speech from my purse. I placed it on his desk. This is a copy of the keynote speech he is planning to give at your festival. I'd like you to read the last 2 pages. I watched his face as he read. I saw his eyes scan the lines, his brow furrowing in confusion. He read the part about the snow blossoms, about God's tears, about the blue and the white. He looked up at me. It's poetic. A bit sentimental, perhaps, but... It's a lie, I interrupted. A complete fabrication. I invented the snow blossoms 3 weeks ago. I made up that Mama quote. It is botanically impossible. It is folklorically non-existent. There are no blue flowers that bloom in the snow on Harlan Peak. I fed him this lie, and he was so desperate for new material, so convinced of his own authenticity, that he didn't even bother to check it. He is going to stand on your prestigious stage and present this nonsense as his deepest ancestral memory. The color drained from Mr. Harrison's face. He understood. He understood that this man was about to make the entire festival a laughingstock. This is disastrous, he whispered, putting the paper down. He'll be torn apart by the critics, by any real academic in the room. He'll humiliate the festival. Yes, I said, he will. I have to cancel, he said, reaching for the phone. I'll call his publisher. We'll say, a family emergency. No, I said. He stopped, his hand hovering over the receiver. What? You will do no such thing, I said, my voice low and firm. You will not cancel. The speech will go on exactly as planned. Are you insane? He asked. He will destroy our reputation. He will destroy his reputation, I corrected. And I will be there to make sure of it. I don't want him to be quietly canceled. I don't want him to slip away and just publish his book next year after this dispute has blown over. I want him exposed. Publicly. I want the world to see the thief, not just hear a rumor about him. He stared at me, a new respect in his eyes. What do you propose? I see on the program that he is scheduled to speak at 4 o'clock on Saturday. The slot after his, at 5:30, is currently listed as a panel on modern poetry. I want you to change it. Change it to what? Change it to this, I said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk where I had written the title. He read it aloud. The source of the story, An Evening with Dr. Nora Hartwood. He looked at me, a slow, sharp smile spreading across his face. He finally understood. You're going to let him give his entire fraudulent speech, he said, almost in admiration, and then you're going to walk out on the same stage. I am going to walk out, I said, and I am going to tell the truth. I am going to tell my stories, the real ones. And I am going to explain, very clearly, the difference between an echo and the voice that it was stolen from. He'll be ruined, Mr. Harrison said, his voice flat. He built his house on my land, I replied, standing up. I am simply taking it back. He stood up too. Dr. Hartwood, it will be as you wish. We will change the program. Your name will be on it by tonight. We will provide you with anything you need. Thank you, I said. I just need a microphone and a glass of water. I walked out of his office, back into the bustling New York street. I felt no triumph, no joy. I just felt a cold, clean, terrible sense of purpose. The next few days were the longest of my life. I lived with him. I ate with him. I smiled at him. And he was giddy, positively vibrating with anticipation. The festival was all he could talk about, in his own way. This trip to Boston is the big one, Nora, he said, the night before he was due to leave. He was packing his bag, not the small Monday suitcase, but his large one. It's a huge conference. If my presentation goes well, it could change everything for us. You have no idea, I thought. I helped him pack. I folded his shirts. I watched him carefully place his Professor Hartwood costume, the tweed jacket, the worn boots, into the bag. And I watched him place the bound manuscript of Echoes from the holler on top, like a crown. He zipped the bag and hugged me. Wish me luck. I pulled back and looked him in the eyes, my face a perfect mask of wifely support. Good luck, Robert, I said. I truly hope you get everything you deserve. He smiled, kissed my forehead, and left the next morning. I waited one day. I graded my midterms. I watered my plants. Then, on Saturday morning, the day of his speech, I packed my own small overnight bag. I put in a simple dark dress. I put in my university ID. And I put in the printed copy of his speech, the one with the snow blossoms. Then I went to the train station and bought a ticket, not to Boston, but to the Midtown Hotel where the New York Literary Festival was being held. The final act was about to begin. I got off the train at Grand Central. I didn't take a cab, I walked. The air was crisp, and the 10-block walk to the Midtown Hotel helped clear my head, solidifying the ice in my veins. The city was loud, full of its own real, chaotic stories, and it made me feel strangely calm. I was just another person on a Saturday afternoon, walking to an appointment, a final, necessary appointment. The hotel lobby was a sea of people. It was exactly what I expected. Men in tweed jackets like Robert's, women with sharp, critical eyes, aspiring writers hovering at the edges, all of them talking too loudly, all of them desperate to be seen. I felt completely invisible, a ghost in a simple dark dress, and I was grateful for it. I walked to the registration desk for the festival. A young, eager volunteer looked up. Name? Nora Hartwood, I said. Her fingers flew over the keyboard of her computer. Ah, yes, Dr. Hartwood. Here is your badge. You're speaking at 5:30 in the Grand Ballroom. It's the source of the story. Sounds fascinating. I took the plastic badge. Seeing my name, my real name and title, printed on it felt like the first small act of reclamation. Thank you, I said. I'm looking forward to it. I found the Grand Ballroom. It was a vast, opulent room with high ceilings and heavy chandeliers. It was already filling up for the 4 o'clock keynote. I slipped into a seat in the very last row, in a dark corner, partially hidden by a large pillar. I put my coat over my small bag on my lap and I waited. From my dark corner, I watched the room. I saw critics I recognized from newspapers, editors from major publishing houses. I saw Mr. Harrison, the festival director, walk by, his face a polite, neutral mask. He glanced toward the back row, and our eyes met for just a second. He gave a single tiny nod. It was all the confirmation I needed. The trap was set. At 4 o'clock on the dot, Mr. Harrison walked onto the stage. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight found him at the podium. Good afternoon, everyone, he said, his voice booming through the speakers. We are so thrilled to have you here for our keynote event. Our speaker today is a man who needs no introduction, though I will give him one anyway. He is a man who has electrified the literary world with his raw, lyrical, and deeply authentic voice. He writes of a world many of us have never seen, but he does it with the authority of someone who has lived and breathed it. It is my great honor to introduce the author of the upcoming Echoes from the Holler, Robert Hartwood. The applause was thunderous, and then he walked out. He was in full costume, the worn tweed jacket, the scuffed boots, the artfully messy hair. He looked every bit the humble mountain poet, the sensitive soul. He walked to the podium, put down his manuscript, and held up a hand, smiling modestly as if to quiet the applause. He looked confident. He looked triumphant. He looked like he was finally home. "Thank you," he said. And his voice, oh, his voice. It was the perfect imitation, the soft, gentle cadence of my home, the voice I had taught him. "Thank you all so kindly. I'm just a little humbled to be here." He adjusted the microphone. I'm not much for big cities, as you might guess. My heart's always back in the hollers of Kentucky, but I'm here today to share a piece of that holler with you. A piece of my soul. He began to speak. For the next 45 minutes, I sat in the darkness and listened to a stranger narrate my life. He told the story of his hardscrabble childhood. He told the story of his pawpaw, and he used my pawpaw's line about the tree with deep roots. The audience sighed, enchanted. He read the section, the most sacred private section, about his mama's death. He told them about the haint in the corner of the room. He spoke my mama's last frightened words, and he did it with a small, convincing catch in his throat. I gripped the armrest of my chair, my fingernails digging into the fabric. I felt the violation all over again, but this time it was public. He was selling my family's most sacred pain to a room full of strangers, and they were buying it. Then he paused. He took a sip of water. He looked up at the audience, his eyes shining with fake, unshed tears. "And now," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper, "I want to read you a passage from the novel. This is the memory that is the very heart of the book. It's the memory that defines the spirit of my people." I braced myself. Here it was. He told them about the snow blossoms. He painted the picture I had given him, the impossible tiny blue flowers blooming in the deep winter snow. He described them as God's tears. The audience was completely silent, hanging on his every word. And then he delivered the final fatal line. "My mama," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "She taught me. She said, 'The mountain keeps its secrets, but it gives its heart to those who look for the blue in the white.' And that, my friends, that is what I have tried to do as a writer. I have looked for the blue in the white." He closed the manuscript. For a second, there was absolute silence. And then the room erupted. People leaped to their feet. The applause was deafening. It was a standing ovation. I watched him bow his head, this humble genius, this authentic voice, accepting the adoration he had so desperately craved, the adoration he had stolen from me. I did not clap. I just sat in the darkness, my heart a cold, heavy stone. Mr. Harrison walked back on stage, clapping along. He shook Robert's hand. "Thank you, Robert," he said, his voice amplified. "Thank you for that." Truly powerful reading, a hard act to follow. Robert, glowing, began to gather his papers, ready to walk off, the conquering hero. "But please, Robert, stay," Mr. Harrison said, a new, sharp edge to his voice. Robert looked up, confused. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Harrison continued, turning to the audience, "as you'll see in your programs, our next event is a special dialogue. It is called The Source of the Story. Please welcome to the stage Dr. Nora Hartwood." A polite, slightly confused applause rippled through the room. People were still on their feet, looking around. From the back of the room, I stood up. I took off my coat, folded it over my arm, picked up my bag, and I began the long, long walk down the center aisle. The journey felt like it took a lifetime. People turned to look at me, this simple, unknown woman in a dark dress. I kept my eyes fixed on the stage. I saw Robert. He was looking out at the crowd, still smiling, confused about who this person was. And then he saw me. His smile didn't just fade, it froze, and then it shattered. His face went a ghostly, sickening shade of white. His mouth fell open. He looked from me to Mr. Harrison, and then, in a gesture of pure animal panic, he fumbled for the printed program on the podium. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely read it. I saw the moment he found my name. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it was almost pathetic. He knew. I reached the steps and walked up onto the stage. I did not look at him. I walked directly to Mr. Harrison, who was watching me with a look of grim respect. I shook his hand. "Dr. Hartwood," he said, his voice clear into the microphone. "Welcome." "Thank you for having me," I replied. I walked to the second podium, the one they had set up for me, just a few feet from where Robert stood, frozen, a statue of a thief. I put down my bag. I took a sip from the glass of water waiting for me. I looked out at the silent, curious, expectant crowd. "Good afternoon," I said. My voice, my real voice, the one his was a pale imitation of, rang through the hall. It was not soft. It was not lilting. It was the clear, strong voice of a professor with the unmistakable, authentic cadence of the mountains he pretended to be from. "My name is Dr. Nora Hartwood. I am a professor of American folklore at the university." I turned, then, and looked directly at the man who was my husband. He flinched, as if I had struck him. "And Robert Hartwood is my family name," I said, turning back to the crowd. "It is not his. My husband's name is Robert Miller. He was born in Brooklyn, New York." A single collective gasp rose from the audience. A wave of sound, of pure shock. People sat down. Whispers exploded. "The accent you just heard him use," I continued, my voice cold and steady, "is my accent, the one I grew up with in Harlan, Kentucky. The stories you just heard him tell, they are my stories." I pointed at him. "The story of a grandmother seeing a haint on her deathbed, that was my mama. The story of a papa's wisdom about a tree, that was my papa. He is a thief. He stole my family's pain, my heritage, my voice, and my name, and he sold it to you for applause." The room was in chaos. People were standing, shouting. "What is this? Is this part of the show?" Robert, his face slick with sweat, lunged for his microphone. "Nora," he yelled, and the voice that came out was not the mountain poet's. It was the harsh, flat, terrified accent of Brooklyn. "Nora, what are you doing? This is a lie. She's not well. This is a professional dispute." "A dispute?" I said, my voice cutting through the noise. "You're right, it is. But I am not unwell, and I brought proof." I turned to the audience. "I knew you would be skeptical. I knew he was a convincing performer. So, a few weeks ago, I set a trap. I invented a piece of folklore, a beautiful, poetic, and completely false story. I told him about the snow blossoms." A few academics in the front row, who had been looking confused, suddenly snapped to attention. "That's right," I said, locking eyes with one of them. "Those impossible blue flowers that bloom in the deep winter snow. God's tears, looking for the blue and the white." I fed him that lie, knowing he was so arrogant in his theft, so lazy that he would never bother to check if it was botanically or folklorically possible. He would simply steal it, as he has stolen everything else, and make it the centerpiece of his masterpiece. And today, not 10 minutes ago, on this very stage, he did exactly that. The game was over. The room turned on him. The academics were shaking their heads. The critics looked furious, embarrassed. You set me up," Robert shrieked, his voice cracking. "You set yourself up," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying in the stunned silence. "You set yourself up the first time you pressed record on a tape recorder I didn't know about. You set yourself up when you put my family name on your secret apartment. You set yourself up when you stole my mama's dying words. I am not the fraud here." I stepped away from the podium. "You came here to hear an authentic mountain voice. Let me show you what one actually sounds like." I took a breath, and I told them the real story of my mama's death. Not the poetic, literary version he had polished. I told them the raw, ugly, painful truth of it. The smell of the room, the fear in her eyes, the simple broken words we spoke. I told them my story, in my voice. When I finished, there was a total, profound silence. No one moved. The audience had heard the truth. They had heard the difference between a performance and a testimony. Then a woman in the front row, a critic I recognized, stood up, and she began to clap. Slowly, then faster. Then another person stood, and another, and within seconds, the entire room was on its feet, giving me a standing ovation. Robert Miller just stood there, a hollow man in a tweed costume, his face ashen. He had been erased. Mr. Harrison stepped forward, his face like thunder. "Thank you, Dr. Hartwood," he said into the microphone. The applause died down. In light of this disgraceful revelation. The New York Literary Festival and the publisher are officially and immediately canceling the launch of Echoes from the Holler and all associated events. We apologize to Dr. Hartwood and to all of you. He nodded to the side of the stage. 2 hotel security guards walked out quietly and stood beside Robert. He didn't even seem to notice them. He just stared at me, his eyes empty. Mr. Harrison took my arm. "Dr. Hartwood, please, come with me." He led me off the stage, past the ruined man who had been my husband, and into a small private office backstage. He closed the door on the noise and the shouting and handed me a bottle of water. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. "I am," I said. And I was surprised to find that it was true. I was exhausted, but I was light. The door opened, and Robert was led in by one of the guards. Mr. Harrison nodded, and the guard closed the door, leaving the 3 of us. "Nora," he whispered. He had taken off the tweed jacket. He just looked like a small, tired man. How could you? How could you do that to me in front of everyone?" I looked at him, and for the first time I felt no anger, no ice. I just felt a profound, weary pity. "How could you?" I answered. "How could you take my life, Robert? My name, my family's most sacred, painful memories. How could you take my mama's dying words and use them to sell books?" That was the public humiliation. I just turned on the lights. I loved your stories," he said, his voice a pathetic whine. "I admired them. I admired you." "No," I said, and my voice was firm. "You didn't admire them. You consumed them. You ate my life and left me with nothing. You told me I wasn't a writer, and then you stole my words and became one. This wasn't love. It was exploitation. It was theft." "But you wouldn't write them," he cried, desperation making him ugly. "They were just sitting there. I gave them a voice." "They had a voice," I said, my own voice rising for the first time. "They had my voice, the one you were imitating. You had no right." He finally broke. He slumped into a chair and put his head in his hands, and a dry, terrible sob tore through him. It was the sound of a man who had built his entire world on a lie and had just watched it burn to the ground. "It's over, Robert," I said, my voice quiet again. "The marriage, the lie, everything. When I get home tomorrow, I want you gone. I want your things out of my apartment. We'll have lawyers handle the rest." He didn't look up. He just nodded, his shoulders shaking. Mr. Harrison opened the door. "Robert, it's time to go." Robert stood, a hollowed-out man, and walked out of the room without looking at me again. I stayed there for a long time, just breathing in the silence. It was over. When I finally came out, the reporters were waiting. But so was someone else. A woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, the editor from the prestigious publishing house, the one who had offered him the contract. She pushed through the reporters and handed me a business card. "Dr. Hartwood," she said, her voice full of anger, but not at me. "That was the bravest thing I have ever seen. And your real story, the one you told at the end, that was the best thing I've heard in 20 years. When you're ready to tell the rest of it, call me. The contract is yours." I looked down at the card, and for the first time that day, I smiled. That was many years ago. I did, of course, get divorced. Robert Miller disappeared from the literary world so completely, it was as if he never existed. I heard he moved back to Brooklyn, working a quiet job in an accounting office. He faded back into the man he was before he tried to steal my life. And I took that editor's offer. I sat down and I wrote my own book. I called it Heartwood, My Voice. I told my stories, the real ones, in my own words. It did very well. It turned out I was a writer after all. The betrayal was a terrible, deep wound. But in a strange, painful way, it was also a gift. It forced me to find the voice I had been hiding, the voice I had let a man convince me wasn't worth hearing. He had to steal my voice for me to finally realize how valuable it truly was. Thank you for listening to me today, for allowing me to share with you this intimate chapter of my life. If my story has touched you, please don't hesitate to leave a like on this video and subscribe to this channel to discover other testimonies like mine. And please share it, because who knows? Maybe someone going through a similar trial right now will find the courage to keep searching, to hope, to believe in the impossible. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? Thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening to me.